So we have learned of a source net for outgoing connection and a destination net for incoming connection. Now let's make things a bit more complex. We also need to understand what is a dynamic net and what is a static net. Well, a dynamic net maps the private IP addresses to the first available public address from a pool of possible addresses that you have got from your ISP. In Fortigate, this can be done using IP pools. The second type of a dynamic net is net overloading. This is the net that we use in our home. That kind of a net maps multiple private IP addresses to a single, only one public IP address. How does it differentiate between the different clients? It does so by using a different source port assignment. Now assume that this source port for a specific client is port number 1072. For another client, the source port is 173. Whenever a session is initiated, it is initiated with the source port. Whenever the web server, let's assume that we have asked for a web page, whenever a web server sends the responding traffic, it is based on those port numbers. So each session is actually mapped with the source port that the client initiated. Now let's take a look at our firewall policy and let's understand how we configure a net overloading and how we configure IP pools. Alright, so let's move over to one of our policies and see the different net that is being used. Now, as you can see, you can enable NAT or disable it. If you choose the use of outgoing interface address, that is many-to-one. Many private addresses will use only one public IP address. That is the NAT overload, but you can also use NAT overload in dynamic IP pools. Now, we don't have any IP pool that is configured, so we can add one right now. So if we use IP pools, we actually use a range of IP addresses instead of the egress interface as we saw before. We can name our pool. Let's name it IP pool. And as we can see, we have 4 types of IP pools. The first one is overload, that is many-to-one or many-to-a-few IP addresses, and the port translation is used. The second one, one-to-one, well, the IP address, the private IP address is being mapped on a first come, first served, and we don't use the port address translation. Now the third one, the fixed port range allows better mapping between the internal private address and the external IP address. It also doesn't use port address translation. Now the third one, the port block allocation, it allows you to limit your client to a number of ports that can be used. You can use a specific number of port block size. Let's say that we use 65. Clients with limited port block size will less likely to be influenced by a distributed denial of service where your network suffers from a flood of ICMP messages.